12:05. I'd like to thank everybody for being here today. We have David Bischof today that's going to do a presentation on Assessment Standards South Africa, the guidelines for assessment and evaluation. The team that will be running interference in the background will be myself, Fatima Peters, and Pakiza Rajab. We are from the DRM Executive from the Psychological Society for South Africa. So I would like to just request everyone to please follow basic housekeeping rules regarding switching off your video and microphone. All questions and answers you can post it into the chat box of the Teams function. We will attend to them at the end of the presentation. We will do all questions and answers. Please feel free to ask any questions that you need clarification on or that you would like the presenter to discuss with us a bit more. All webinars audio will be recorded for distribution on all social media platforms to allow anyone that is unable to be here today to watch the presentation. So David Bischof is currently the Director for Assessment Standards South Africa. He is the Chairperson for People Assessment in Industry. It's an interest group for social and industrial and organizational psychology of South Africa. He is the Director of Business Development of Organizational and Management Technology. He was previously the Senior Manager of Assessment Center at Dalarat Consulting and the past Chairperson for Assessment Center Study Group ACSG. He holds a master's degree in research psychology cum laude and is registered as both a research psychologist as well as a psychometrist in independent practice with the HPCSA. He has presented at multiple conferences for ACSG as well as ASSA on assessment, leadership, and global talent management. David focuses on ensuring that testing exists in the South African context as a value-adding, ethical, and fair practice. His specializations include psychometrics, leadership assessment, talent interventions, and project management. Welcome, David, and thank you so much for kicking off the first wonderful webinar for the SAISA DRM. We are really lucky and very happy to have you with us. You may go ahead. I'm going to be switching off my video, camera, and microphone. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much for the introduction, and also I really appreciate the opportunity and the invitation to come and present some information on Assessment Standards South Africa and to answer a couple of questions around ASSA and our current activities. Yes, so I think I've created a structure for the presentation or the webinar really just to cover from the onset just the legislation, because there's still a lot of confusion around the legislation as far as the use of assessments is concerned in the South African environment. So I thought I'd give you a bit of background information on that, because it's also important to understand how that led to the establishment of Assessment Standards South Africa. And then I'll talk a little bit around who Assessment Standards South Africa is and our activities to date, and then give you some insight into our system, our online system that we're busy piloting at the moment, which provides an opportunity for the submission of tests for certification, and give you a bit of an example of what the system currently looks like, and then provide some opportunities for questions as well. All right, so yes, let's take a bit of a step back into history. The South African history around the use of assessments is quite a turbulent history over the years. But I suppose really where I wanted to start to kind of give you a sense of where the Health Professions Council of South Africa currently is at from an assessment perspective is back in 2014, there was an amendment to Section 8 of the Employment Equity Act. And the amendment was really a part of a particular section, which you're probably all fairly familiar with, which really related a lot to the requirements of the Employment Equity Act from an assessment perspective, which said that psychological testing and other similar assessments of an employee are prohibited unless the test or assessment being used has been scientifically shown to be valid and reliable, can be applied fairly, and is not biased. And that's been a standard of the Employment Equity Act for many, many years. Apologies. I just wanted to remove a section there. Yeah. So the change was made in 2013, and paragraph D was amended to indicate that the test needs to be certified by the Health Professions Council of South Africa or any other body which may be authorized by law to certify those tests or assessments, which was quite a wide-ranging and vague type of area to kind of include. And really, this addition in terms of the section stated that testing would be prohibited unless it has been certified by the HPCSA or any other body which may be authorized by law to certify these tests or these assessments. Now, back then, the Association of Test Publishers then took the HPCSA to court around this particular amendment. And the reason for that was really around a number of different areas. The one being that from a certification perspective, the HPCSA didn't really have the structure in place to certify an assessment, and there was really no clarity around who that other professional body might be that could assist with the certification. It took a long time for these tests to kind of get through the process and the system, and there were questions around where the HPCSA should be focusing in terms of this particular area. So it went through a court process, and the Association of Test Publishers won that particular court case. And essentially what happened is that, in the government gazette at the time, the whole proclamation was seen to be null and void and of no force in effect. And that clauses A to C would still stand as far as the Employment Equity Act is concerned. And then, there were just areas around costs, etc. Subsequent to this, then the HPCSA released a media statement in 2017 really saying that this effectively means that for now, psychological testing or similar assessments of an employee do not need to be certified by the HPCSA, and that they were not going to challenge the High Court's decision, which really pulled back to what the initial mandate was before the change was made to the Employment Equity Act. And that really then brings us to where the current legislation stands. And the current legislation really says that if you're using a psychological test or a psychometric test, you still need to comply with the sections A, B, and C of the Employment Equity Act. And this holds true if it's a psychological test or not being used. So if you're using if you're doing an exam or an interview or a leadership assessment or whatever it might be, you need to make sure that, sorry, I'm getting a bit of interference there. You need to make sure that whatever you're doing, it complies with these particular areas of the Employment Equity Act. And if you're using a test that measures a psychological construct, this has to be registered with the Health Professions Council of South Africa. And it can only be used by somebody registered with the HPCSA in terms of, their psychological categories. So they put forward a revised mandate, the HPCSA during 2019, which really said that, the Psychometrics Committee of the HPCSA are only going to focus on the following areas. They're going to classify an assessment and really focusing on classifying it if it does have elements of a psychological construct within it, that they're going to publish a list of psychological tests and psychometric instruments, which they've been doing in the past, but they're going to do this more regularly. They're going to look at developing guidelines, training standards related to psychometric and psychological assessments that can inform what the universities are busy doing, and guidelines for ethical practices, look at minimal requirements or standards for psychological tests, and then they indicated, and this is an important area, their classification will entail verifying whether a test is psychological or not. Therefore, if you're a test provider, you can submit your test, and I've highlighted this particular area in yellow because they've put this in their mandate, but it goes against what they're actually supposed to be doing. That they say they're going to look at evidence of psychometric properties and indication of whether the item content was culturally appropriate, but that is not really what they're going to be doing because that doesn't fall within the mandate of classification, and that there would be no cost for this. Previously, there was a cost for this. Now, if I just summarize all of that, what it means is if you are a test provider and you're using a test within the South African environment, you still need to make sure that it complies with the Employment Equity Act. Number one, that's the most important thing. And number two, you need to submit it to the HPCSA for classification. And classification will really say, well, this test contains a psychological construct or it doesn't. And if it contains a psychological construct, it needs to be used by a psychologist or a psychometrist as an example. And if it doesn't, then it doesn't. That's really where the buck stops with the HPCSA, and they're running quite a tight and slick process at the moment. I've engaged with a couple of providers who say it's a fairly straightforward and quick process. You get a certificate telling you if your test is classified or not. But then the whole question is around, well, what then? Because you can submit a test for classification and the HPCSA can classify it, but it could be an absolute load of rubbish. It could be a terrible test with poor constructs and terrible validity and reliability, and people will use it because it's classified by the HPCSA. And that begs the question around certification. So from a certification process, this is what then started to happen. Way back when in March 2015, there was a meeting to kind of look at a new process around certification. That involved the HPCSA, and a couple of discussions were had. But then we started, as a number of different bodies, looking at putting together a task force to consider establishing a body to oversee test standards. So this was previously being done by the HPCSA, but not being done really effectively. And there was a real gap in this particular area that needed to be addressed now. And when that task force was put together, it comprised of representatives, yes, from the HPCSA, from ASSA, from CISA, from the Association of Test Publishers, and also from the International Test Commission, which is an important stakeholder as far as best practices around test certification is concerned. And then over the years, through ASSA and CISA and the ATP, we started to host a number of events to look at a potential framework for test certification. So a couple of debates at the CISA and ASSA conferences. And then finally in 2018, a non-profit organization was established, which is really where Assessment Standards South Africa comes into play, which started to look at potential processes and structures and guidelines and best practice models for South African evaluation criteria, not just looking at psychological, but also looking at non-psychological tests. A couple of other events were then held. ASSA was formed. There were interactions with the Department of Labour and presentations to the Health Professions Council of South Africa. And then towards 2018, there was really then a focus on the development of these particular test guidelines and evaluation criteria. Once those were finalized, those were presented at the ACSG, SAOPSA conferences, and they were sent out to all of the stakeholder groups, to CISA, SAOPSA, ACSG, ATP, for comment and for review and for any additions that needed to be made. They were finalized, and then over the last 2 years, ASSA has been looking at setting up an online system to kind of manage and streamline the entire process. So who is ASSA then? ASSA is, and this is important, it's an independent non-regulatory body. So we're not a legislated body. We're not government mandated. It's a voluntary non-regulatory body. But we've spent a lot of time building and getting the support of the relationships with the Department of Labour and the HPCSA to look at this best practice and technology-enabled certification process. ASSA's aim is to really not just look across psychological tests, but also to look at kind of non-psychological tests. Because if you look at the current testing environment, both locally and internationally, we've got technology has hit our space in a very, very big way. We've got the use of areas like gamification and artificial intelligence and machine learning and robotics and big data. All of these areas are entering the assessment space. And I can spend a whole nother 2 hours discussing where and how that's happening. It's a huge area for us. So it's important that we focus on also understanding this particular area and how we put in place processes to measure those types of tests. And the whole idea is that the HPCSA will classify, but then ASSA will focus on a certification process. So our core purpose would really be to review the quality of tests that are available for use in South Africa and to use best practices. So this is happening globally in a lot of countries. This process is in place, the voluntary submission of assessment instruments for objective evaluation and review, and to use what other countries have been doing, but bring in the South African context and criteria to really raise the general standard and awareness of using quality tests within our environment, which is so very important. Our core activities are really around providing a minimum standards focus in South Africa as it relates to tests and testing, and then to streamline the process. And we've already done this. We've built a very nice website. We engaged with an IT service provider, and we've built a website very applicable to the South African environment, an online platform, so that it's quick and easy for a test provider to submit a test, access information, and to kind of put their test through the entire process. And then, as I indicated, to kind of apply it to psychological or other similar assessments, non-psychological assessments. Okay, so our activities to date, we established a task force back then under the leadership of the late Professor Dion Meyering. And this was really one of Dion's, pipe dreams. And we really feel proud that we are living out one of the pipe dreams that he had in place, after he passed away. But the task force was established to look at kind of and develop the test content and evaluation criteria. And this was really based on FBA, which is the kind of international test certification guidelines. It's a very robust set of guidelines that have been developed, but to kind of customize those and apply those to the South African environment. A further task force was established under the leadership of Professor Henny Crick, who I'm sure a lot of you may have heard about, as well as Dr. Nicola Taylor and Professor Marie de Beer. And Sumaya Lahir was also quite heavily involved here to kind of look at the ASSA test review process based on international models and to include test submission and review process. Then everything was shared with the HPCSA, ASSA, the ATP, CISA for comment and input during 2019. 2020, we spent developing the online assessment certification process. And what we're doing at the moment is we're conducting a pilot. So we offered a free pilot to service providers that are members of the Association of Test Publisher, and other interested providers also had the opportunity to submit a free test, and they just needed to join the ATP in order to do that. And we've got a couple of tests that are currently sitting in the process and that we're having a look at. We do require many more tests, so if anybody's interested, you are welcome to still join the ATP and submit, or if you're with the ATP, you can submit these tests, because we want to have at least 10 tests that we've put through the whole process to make sure that the system works and it's robust, and we can just finalize and make sure that all the criteria in place and that the system works well. And we're really envisaging, hopefully towards the end of the year, but by latest early next year, to have a system that we can release to the public and that can be used quite effectively. So this is just kind of an overview of what this test review process looks like, and it's quite a streamlined process. And I'm just going to jump out of the screen very briefly and just show you this particular website over here. So if you've got some time, please go and access the website. It's assa.co.za. And it's really nice in that it provides all the information that I've really spoken about. So why was ASSA developed? And there's some links then across to the various societies that have been involved there. It gives you some nice information around our kind of mission statement and our structure and our activities, but also very importantly, it clarifies the South African legislation for you. So really just brings out the black and white around what took place, what needs to happen, where the focus needs to be. And it's a good reference point, for all of you as professionals, but also to share with other individuals who might be a little bit uncertain around what is going on here. Then the site also provides information on an overview of the test review process that I'm going to share with you now shortly as well. And it then provides a direct link for people to submit a test, which then links up to our brand new Assessments Standards South Africa test review site. And that enables then somebody to submit a test into the process. So everything's kind of automated and in place. And what's also quite nice is, for those of you that are interested, all of the review criteria documentation is here, which is fantastic. So you can go and have a look at what is required to submit a test. You can actually go and have a look at the test review form, which then starts to give you information around what are the types of areas that we're going to be assessing, what do you need to provide from a statistical and a research perspective. And this is powerful, not just in knowing what to submit for a test, but also if you are using tests within your particular area. From this, you can get a sense of what should be in place around that test and what are the criteria that we're looking at and what's required. And you can almost, if you've got the time and the energy, do a bit of an evaluation internally of a particular test if you want to go and download this document and have a look through the information. So everything's on ASSA, and you're welcome to go and have a look through that data and get a sense of what it's all about. So just a broad guideline in terms of the criteria that we're talking about here. So what happens is a test provider can submit an application. They go into the system and they can submit the application and provide all of the information. We then have an administrative check in place to make sure that all necessary documentation has been submitted, and if anything is missing, then we can provide that there's information around what needs to be provided. We have an editor that's currently consulting and working with us to have a look at the content. The idea is then that the 2 reviewers are assigned to a particular test, and a trainee reviewer has also been included. And this is really where our collaboration with the International Test Commission has come into place, because the International Test Commission has actually developed a set of training guidelines for reviewers. And we're going to be looking at that and customizing those for the South African environment. But through this process, we want to be able to train and empower and bring new test reviewers into the system, that they can also get involved here and, almost to focus on this as a career if they want to, and really get involved in the process. So what happened is the review is then it's then checked and then it's submitted, and feedback's given to the editor. The editor then compiles the review and starts to check the facts and looks through all the information. And then there's a fairly robust process to say, well, if the evidence is adequate, we can then say that this test is a good test, and we can issue a certificate and we can publish a review. If it's inadequate, then the information is either the feedback is provided to the submitter, and the submitter has the opportunity to either fix what is incorrect or where we need additional information, and then it's either a successful submission or it's unsuccessful, or maybe they need to fully resubmit. For example, one of the tests that came into our system had a lot of international data, but it didn't have any South African data around norms and those types of things. So the request from the review is to now go and gather all of those norms, because we require those to comply with the Employment Equity Act, and you need to make sure that everything is in place before you resubmit the test. The evaluation rating scale is very straightforward. So is there excellent data that we have available to us? Is it good? Is it adequate? Is it inadequate? Do we not have information that has been provided? As an example, and in certain evaluation areas, we might not require that particular information, dependent on the test and how and where it's going to be used. The pre-review checklist is quite comprehensive, so it covers all the material that needs to be included in the submission process. And in terms of the manual, the test manual that gets submitted, what is the rationale of the test, what is the description of the development of the test, a description of test scales, items, rating scales, administration, scoring and interpretation procedures, and sufficient evidence to be able to review then the psychometric properties so that we can do our job here. The reliability information covers most types of reliability coefficients. Validity information looks at areas like content validity for things like situational judgment tests and assessment centers and interviews and those types of things. We look at construct validity, criterion-related validity, bias equivalence, and then very importantly, the norms, normative, domain-based, and criterion-based types of norms. And then it kind of looks like this. So these are just a couple of dashboard, a couple of screenshots of the actual system. And it's really automated. We spent a lot of time with the developer of the system to really automate and make the process quite straightforward and to kind of iron out the kinks. And here's an example of a test provider's dashboard where they've submitted a couple of tests and they can start to see, for example, let me just move that out the way. What are my tests? When did I submit them? Has it been approved? If it's been approved, let me look at the submission and the feedback from the editor and the reviewers, and I can download a certificate. If it's under review, where is it in the process under review? And is it incomplete that I need to provide more information and then kind of create a submission around the information? Here's your application terms and conditions. So really what we require, from the reviewer, and just the terms and conditions in terms of submitting this information and what needs to be followed in order for us to do our job correctly over here. Then the person can go in and submit an application, and here's just an example of an application. So what's the name of the assessment, what's the short name, who's the author, who's the distributor, when did we publish that particular assessment, what is then the submission criteria, what is it covering from a content domain perspective, is it an ability assessment or a clinical or a cognitive or a whatever it might be. Description of the population, the number of scales, and a description of the variables and the response mode. So is it paper and pencil, oral? And we've tried to cover absolutely every particular area that we can from a test perspective. What are the demands on the test takers? Another example. And then the types of information that need to be provided, in terms of the documentation. What type of a manual is it? What is the method of publication? Is it online, paper-based, CD or DVD-based? And then test-related qualifications required by the provider of the test. So, what type of information is required there? And then the scoring procedures. What type of a scoring procedure is used? Is it online, bureau-based, computer scoring, manual scoring, whatever it might be, and the scales that are being used. And then the opportunity for the provider to upload all of their documentation. So the idea is that there's no, physical paper-based storage required. Everything is stored on the system, and we can then start to develop a repository of information around the manual and the supporting documentation and the test questions and the answer protocols that need to be uploaded. And then it's also automated in terms of applications. So when somebody submits a test, they can receive an email. When it's being reviewed, they can receive an email. And when it's kind of being then submitted and finalized, there's an email process there as well. And that also implies internally. So when a reviewer gets a test and the editor gets a test, everything is automated in terms of the entire process. So that is essentially, the full process that ASSA is currently engaged on. And as I indicated, where we're sitting at the moment is we've got a couple of tests sitting in the system. We're busy refining the system based on those submissions. We're waiting for more tests to be kind of uploaded. We're getting involved in various discussions with relevant stakeholders. I know that we've been invited to participate in a workshop with the Department of Higher Education around interest questionnaires, and there's a big question from them around the administration of interest questionnaires by non-professionals, and how can we create a proper process that allows non-professionals to do this, because there's a huge need for this within the South African environment. We're having a discussion with them on Friday and then next week. We're engaging with the ITC around the training guidelines, and I know the ITC are having their conference in Cape Town, South Africa next year, and we're also going to be involved with them as far as that is concerned. But we're really hoping at the end of the day to have a very robust system in place to allow a test provider to very quickly submit a test through the process, and at the end of it for us to have on our website a list of good tests, essentially, that a person or a organization or whatever it might be, if they're looking at a test, can go and see, well, that's a good test. It's been classified by the Health Professions Council, it's been certified by ASSA, and I can now use it with a lot of confidence within my environment. And this for us is very important because, as you all know, and as I know, there's a lot of strange and dodgy and weird tests kind of sitting in the system. A lot of them you can access via Facebook and online. A lot of questions around what sits underneath the engine of those particular tests. A lot of practitioners out there that are using psychological tests that are not registered professionals with the Health Professions Council. And we're just hoping to now clear all that up and make it a lot more of a robust and a best-in-class process that we can put in place. It's been run highly successfully in other countries, so why can't we do it in South Africa? And that's really our aim at the end of the day, to improve the quality of testing across the board. So yes, that's really the information that I wanted to share across the webinar. I see we've got quite a bit of time for questions, so I'm going to hand over to the CISA team to perhaps facilitate a couple of questions.
Hi, thank you for the lovely presentation, David. I see there's one question in the chat box. The question reads as follows: should we get assessment classified first with the HPCSA, or can we certify it with ASSA without classification by the HPCSA? How much does it cost to certify a test with ASSA?
Very good question. So we recommend to people submit it to the HPCSA first. Because then they can give you a sense of if it needs to be classified or not. But if you do submit it to us first, we're going to look at it. And we're going to go, hang on a second, this contains a psychological construct. Please submit it to the HPCSA. So you can do either or, but it's probably easier to go to the HPCSA first to get the classification in place. Secondly, from a costing perspective, at the moment, we're busy finalizing the ASSA costing structure. As it stands, we've offered the ATP test providers a free pilot assessment. So if you are a member of the ATP, you can submit your test for free to go through the process. If you're not, you can join the ATP. And if you then have joined the ATP, you can submit the test for free through the process. And it's useful to be a part of the ATP because they really kind of are very collaborative in understanding the issues and the problems that all the test providers in South Africa are experiencing. So it's a good organization to be a part of, and also to keep up to date with what's happening, I suppose, with your competitors if you're a test provider, but also where people can work a bit more effectively across that particular area.
Okay. The second question that we have is, who is eligible to be a reviewer, and how much time will this process involve?
That is a very good question as well. So we're busy engaging with the ITC around the review process, and for me it would probably be somebody with a fairly strong psychometric background, because you would need, you would get that training in order to be able to understand how to certify a test and to look at all of those, validity, reliability, norms, all of those particular areas. But we haven't confined it to psychometrists. We're still getting a sense of what would be required and what the ITC are doing. Currently, the ITC process is quite comprehensive and it's quite labor intensive. It's a whole good couple of months of training that you've got to go through and certification that you've got to go through. But what we're trying to do now with the ITC is develop a more focused South African program that can be used. So I suppose I'm sounding a bit vague. I'm sounding a bit vague because we're still in process there in terms of understanding, well, what exactly do we need to put in place here? And hopefully towards the end of the year, we'll have a good idea of what that looks like.
Okay. I see we have someone busy typing. I think we should just give that person a few minutes. For classification with HPCSA, who can we contact to get classification? Is there a specific person to contact?
There is a lady by the name of Portia at the HPCSA that deals with the admin side of the psychometrics committee. Her name is Portia Kati. I've got an email address, so I'll put that in the chat towards the end of the group, but she's the person that you would submit that information to or request more information around the HPCSA classification process.
Okay. Our executive member is saying that as soon as we hear about the review process, we will also inform all SAISA members. So if you're a SAISA member, we will put that information on the SAISA DRM website, and all members will be informed on the newsletter as well. Thank you, Pakiza, for that information. Okay, so it seems like psychometric assessment will be something that will be a bit more accessible now that we have the website and various other tools that is much more accessible online. I think prior to the online fourth industrial revolution, things were a bit more of a challenge to get through. But I think that this whole automated process will make it much easier for us to then develop culturally sensitive and much more informed assessments that can be used by more people.
Yes, Fatima. But I think, what I've learned through the whole process and what's taken place with the HPCSA, that at the end of the day, the buck stops with us as practitioners. It doesn't stop with the organizations we work for or the societies that we work for. If somebody takes up a test and they're unhappy with the outcomes and the results, etc., and it goes to the CCMA, we are the ones that have got to stand up in front of the CCMA and explain why we've used that test and what the outcomes were coming from. So we really need to empower ourselves as practitioners to understand what is required, to question the test, not to accept a test at face value, to ask all the questions that we need to ask, to look underneath the hood of the test and understand what goes into it, because the buck stops with us at the end of the day. So that for me is also just an important point to make.
Yes, ethically, that is really an important consideration if you as the practitioner are held liable for what it is that you do with your client and patient in practice. So ethically, we need to have much more robust systems to manage ourselves as practitioners. So that's quite a good point to make. Also, for everyone's information, Portia K at hpcsA.co.za is the email address that you can use should you want to contact the person regarding assessments at HPCSA. Somebody missed the beginning of the presentation and they would like clarification on if it is necessary to have an assessment through ASSA and HPCSA. Would it be necessary to have ASSA assessment for HPCSA classification of the test?
Perhaps, sorry, is that Piotr? Would you mind just clarifying the question?
Yes, hi, sorry. So would those processes go concurrently, and would they be required, I mean, for HPCSA to classify the test, would they require the ASSA assessment of the test? I'm really sorry, maybe you said it at the beginning, but I just wasn't present. I couldn't hear the beginning of the presentation.
No problem at all. So they are two completely independent processes. The HPCSA is kind of the mandated legislative process. ASSA is a non-regulatory voluntary body. So you don't have to submit a test to ASSA. It's totally up to you if you want to, but you have to submit a test to the HPCSA for classification. So they're separate. And I think that the recommendation is to follow the HPCSA route first. And then from there, once it's classified, or even if it's not classified, you can still put it then through the ASSA process.
Thanks so much. Yeah, that's answered my question. Thank you.
Absolutely.
I think for everyone's clarification, it's really important to understand that the HPCSA is the legal body to which all practitioners are liable. They control the Health Professions Act, so everything that you do needs to conform with HPCSA standards. So as a point of order and to protect yourself, it's really important that you make sure that you follow what HPCSA says, because as David mentioned, you don't want to be taken to CCMA for issues relating to assessment. I see Palisa Mudisa has a question. Palisa, you may go ahead.
Thank you, Fatima. Am I audible?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay. Just a question for David. Firstly, thank you so much for the insightful presentation. I heard you mention interest questionnaires while you were presenting, and that you will be meeting up with the Department of Education because there is a huge need for such questionnaires. So I just wanted to know, as a point of clarity, were you referring to the development of these questionnaires or the actual administration of the test by the psychometrists or psychologists?
Look, it's more hot off the press. It seems to be a project that is being engaged with by an international body that was kind of looking at interest questionnaires globally and the need for these to help students from a career perspective. And the fact that there's problems in a lot of countries, not just South Africa, where the HPCSA limits people based on registration to do that. But there's a lot of career guidance counselors and those types of individuals that are on the ground that can provide a lot of input into it. So they've engaged with us because I think we can maybe give some guidelines around getting those tests through some kind of a certification process. And then understanding, well, which of these interest questionnaires do not actually need to be classified, that can be used by practitioners and teachers and kind of people on the ground. So that's where that whole initiative is standing up. To be honest with you, I've really just received a mail from the department and a request to be a part of a 2-day workshop next week, and then we're speaking to the director on Friday around this initiative. But I think that's great because it's really questioning what makes sense at the end of the day. What restricts us, what doesn't make sense, to enable us to help the youngsters in South Africa to make the right choices in their lives around their careers.
That is a really important function, especially with people applying to university. Whatever degrees open, they apply for. And it's like, you got home economics as a subject in your matric year. How are you applying for psychology and social work with home economics? So I do think that is a really good initiative to try and develop some form of interest questionnaires for young people to access so that they can make a bit more of an informed decision about the subjects that they choose for the career path moving forward. I think that would really empower young people to make better choices. So the question so far has been really excellent. We are starting on the wrapping up of the webinar. If there are any additional questions, please could you put it in the chat box in the next few minutes so that we know that there's something that you would like to discuss. So, yes. So, David, considering you're a research psychologist, don't you think that the development of these psychometric assessments is something within the ambit of research psychologists as well as various other psychologists in the HPCSA registration category?
Yeah, I believe so. Although I believe that the psychometric grounding is probably really where it maybe not where it should sit, but where it tends to sit because of the amount of expertise and insight that you have from your studies to the development of assessments and psychometrics, as an example. So, but yes, I mean, the focus around research psychology is also looking at the research in these particular areas and the kind of best way to go with them.
Okay. I don't see anyone adding any more questions, David. But thank you so much. It's been a quite informative and useful presentation. We will be uploading the presentation onto YouTube, LinkedIn, and Facebook. So thank you for today. I think we can wrap up and say goodbye to everyone. Thank you everyone for being here today. Just for information purposes, we are going to have other webinars for the rest of the year. There's one on decolonization. There's another one on doing a scoping review. We're developing quite a few webinars for students on qualitative research methodology. And then we have one presentation for academics on the publication process, and one on another assessment presentation by Prof. Lazarus and Prof. Lazarus. So that is for the plan for the next year. We will send you communications as those webinars become available. Thank you so much, David, for being here. Thank you, Pakiza. I see our other DRM executive member, Mandy, was here. So we've had quite a lovely engagement. And bye to everyone. Thanks for being here. Bye.
Thank you for the opportunity. Thanks for the engagement. Take care then, everybody. Enjoy the week.